for being our Zoom queen and guiding all us old farts through this. We are all quickly heading up the learning curve of Zoom this last month, and we're getting there. We've learned how to have a Zoom happy hour for Welcome to Whales Day, and that was really fun. And I know the last of this series of webinars for Orca Month, we're going to have a spy hoppy hour where we just, bring your beverage of choice and your stories to share. So we hope you'll join us for all of our webinars all month long. Let's see, I'm going to do, is that me getting feedback here? Turn that off. See if that helps. I'm going to do a short slideshow, and Howie will just jump in on any of these slides or things that I'm saying that you have something to add. This is our 14th Orca Month, so a lot has happened during those years. I'm going to go to my slideshow here. Okay, everybody is seeing that now. So we started out calling June Orca Awareness Month. Trying to do this in sync, but I just really love this photo about Granny. And as I was going through just different historic tidbits from the years, what I realized is each year we had sort of different things, issues that were going on, or orcas that passed on that we were grieving for, like when we lost Granny. And so it's kind of changed over the years and just focused on with the theme of whatever was going on that particular year. You don't need to read all of this, but this is just an excerpt I found out of our first news release for our first Orca Month in 2007, kind of explaining why we did it. And we had done a petition and got 500 signatures to ask Governor Gregoire to proclaim June as Orca Awareness Month. Of course, then we learned that you don't really even need a petition to proclaim an Orca Month. You just ask the governor or fill out a form. So, but it was great that there was all that support, and it did kick off our efforts. The third paragraph of this is what is interesting in that we started Orca Month in June because that's when KNL pods typically return to join J-pod in our inland waters. So we thought June would be a great time to focus attention on the problems they face, with a real focus on salmon, and also to just let people know how fascinating Southern residents are and their family cohesion and their cultures. And that in June, usually by the end of June, back in the olden days, Ken would have seen all the Southern residents and been able to do the full survey and know what new calves had been born and what whales were missing. Of course, now things have changed drastically. And some years, it isn't until January, even then, that Ken sees all the pods. And so this was in 2007 that, it was just a given that they would all be back by mid to late June. So ironically, as we face these COVID times and we were forced to change our original Orca Month plans to have our in-person events, to move those to October, when Orca Network has done several Orca salmon events and an event called Fin Fest with would-be watershed stewards, to celebrate the time when the Southern residents come down into Puget Sound after the chum and blackmouth salmon. So we're going to reschedule, we hope, depending on what happens between now and then, our in-person events for the fall and kind of revive that October Fin Fest or Orca Salmon Month. But we're also considering just the possibility of moving Orca Month to October because, you know, now if we're lucky by then Ken has most of the data on who has returned because things have changed so much. So our original petition just listed the declining orca population. You know, this was around the time that, you know, right after they were listed under the ESA. And sadly, looking at this, their population was currently at 85. And in 2006, there were 5 presumed dead whales. So, you know, it had really, things were failing quickly, but now we look at where we are now and we're more than 10 below that. So that's really a sad thing to look at when they've been endangered for so long. So here's our first Orca Awareness Month proclamation. So each year we've had proclamations signed either by Chris Gregoire or Jay Inslee. And when we first started Orca Month, it was in partnership with the Washington Wine and Beverage Company. They had wanted to do a fundraiser for the whales after they became endangered, and they wanted to help spread awareness about them. So they were doing marketing first with their Orca wines, or the Hoodsport Orca wine, and later with their more modern Orca wines, which now come in nifty cans, which Howie will model. I don't know if you can see him on the screen too. So you can buy Orca wine in cans still, and they do still support us. And they've also purchased a major interest in fish brewing, if you would rather have beer, and they support salmon organizations. So it's kind of neat. And what we really liked about this partnership was through their tasting room and all the grocery stores, and they had posters and back cards and information about orcas. So it really shared it to a much broader audience than we do. So then we started inviting other organizations and trying to get other businesses involved as well. So this is I'll go through our series of logos here. We had this logo with J1 ruffles in it for the first couple years. And then this is 2009 when we got to meet with Chris Gregoire to sign the proclamation in person with Karen Monroe. So that was really cool. And then in 2009, for a couple of years, the Puget Sound Partnership, back when they had more funding and more staff, joined with us to co-sponsor Orca Awareness Month to help get the word out and through their audience and through the EcoNet program. And then, let's see, this is 2013 with Governor Inslee. And, you know, this is the one thing, who are these whales and why should we care? So it's about educating people so they would learn about the whales and to make them want to care and take action. In 2014, we did, for Orca Month, the MV Toki Tai was the new ferry that we had been able to get named after Lolita, after her original name. So they christened and began the ferries running in 2014. So we celebrated on the ferry that year, and that was kind of exciting. In 2016, We had just formed the Orca Salmon Alliance with other orca and conservation in salmon organizations that we had formed in 2015 and co-sponsored Orca Month together for the first time in 2016 and have been doing that ever since, which has been a great way to get other organizations involved. And since 2016, we also got the state of Oregon and British Columbia involved in celebrating and officially proclaiming Orca Month in June. And the beautiful logo, you might recognize Sarah Haisang Shimazu's beautiful artwork that she did for the logo, which says it all so beautifully. And then in 2019, we changed the name to Orca Action Month as the population of the whales kept going down and people were becoming more and more aware of the whales and the issues, and people were asking, what can we do? So we really started focusing our Orca Month on actions and getting people involved and doing events that educated people, but also gave them ideas for taking action. We also developed the Orca Action or Survivors card that I forgot to put in the slideshow, but we've had several versions of those with Sarah's beautiful artwork and Cindy and others working on them that gives 17 actions for people to take in honor of Telequa's 17 days of carrying her dead baby around. And people really appreciate having some actions that they can take. So we've used Sarah's updated logo for the last 2 years. And last year also, with the governor's task force and the Orca bill, the legislation that was being passed, they asked Cindy to come, and the governor personally presented her with the Orca Month proclamation for last year. So that was a very exciting and proud moment. And it was encouraging to see some extra state attention being paid to the orcas. There's still a long way to go, but there are still meetings, and but as many of you know, more needs to happen, and I'm sure Ken will talk about that. And then that takes us to this year, and this is just one of the Orca Month graphics that has been made for social media. So you'll see that on our Orca Month page, which is orcamonth.com. And then Orca Network also has the list of Orca Month activities and our webinar, our Orca Month webinars, and our youth event as well. And I think that's it. So I don't know if there's any questions for this part, or if we want to wait. Why don't we wait till the end? How are we on time? Howard, what do you think? Turn around to look at him.
I don't see any questions yet.
Okay. Do you have anything to add to that before we introduce Ken?
Well, only that that subtle change from Orca awareness to Orca action really does reflect the sense of urgency, the sense of needing to do something, anything, everything, whatever is possible immediately to help these orcas survive, to help them live well and
I also think it, you know, part of it was we
oh, sorry.
done. Yeah, you need to. Yeah, I think so. But also the decades of work by Ken and Orca Network and other organizations to educate has, brought more awareness to the public about orcas. But then, Telequa did 100 times more than any of us with her tour of grief. Every outreach event we did after that, everyone knew about the orcas, and they knew about the mother carrying her dead babies, from 4-year-old girls, that came up telling us about it in tears, and all asking, what can we do? What can we do? So that made a huge change too.
Right. Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, we're moving on.
Okay, so there are two questions I see.
Oh, sorry.
So, and Cindy, I know there have been efforts to get California to join in Orca Month, and they were working on a bill, I think, instead. Cindy, do you know where that is at? Or
yeah, and first I just want to, Howie, can you take off your headphones, because people are having a really hard time hearing you when you talk.
you're not there? We lost her.
Oh, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Oh, sound off, sorry. Okay.
All right, so that might be hopefully better for Howie, because people are having a hard time hearing him.
Our
Give it
technical
out now.
difficulty is that Susan and I are in the same room, so
Right.
that there is this echo effect if we have both of our laptop speakers on. But I think we can make it work.
Yep, it's working now. Thank you.
Okay, good.
So to
Oh,
answer
good.
your question, yes, California hasn't really joined into Orca Month yet. We're still kind of trying, but we do have Oregon and British Columbia as part of it. So, but yeah, we would love to get some participation from California for sure.
And
Great.
I believe the city of Gig Harbor is joining in, but I don't know if I'm supposed to say that yet, so you didn't hear it here. And yeah, the other question about whether Orca Action Month and OSA is to bring Toki home. That is for Orca Network. That's been part of our effort of a lot of the things we do. And we've done several Orca Month events around Toki with the ferry. And then one year when some new capture footage became available, we did an event at the Seattle Aquarium. But it's not a real official effort of OSA, although we talk about the capture era in the proclamation for Orca Month. So, it's in there, but not a main focus of OSA. Is more focused on getting more salmon for the orcas.
Okay. So now I will introduce Ken. And just to say that Orca Network's origins really came from Orca Survey and the Center for Whale Research, and Ken's work over the years since 1976. And there's been a lot of problems, a lot of organization, a lot of boat repairs, a lot of every kind of difficulty over the years. But Ken has maintained an incredible focus and adherence to the scientific method, into gathering the data, presenting the facts reliably, and has managed to photo identify left and right sides of every single southern resident orca every year since 1976. It's an incredible achievement, and it has revealed so much about them. So without doing much further, I am happy to introduce Ken Balcomb, founder, chief scientist, director of the Center for Whale Research.
Oh, thank you, Howie and Susan and everybody for participating in this webinar. I'm going to give you a little history on how and why we got started on this Orca survey. You know, everybody knows that these whales, the southern resident killer whales that frequent the Salish Sea, were the objects of capture in the 1960s through the early 1970s. And they were captured both in Canada and in the United States. And more than 50 were removed and sent around the world for display in marine parks. The public began to be concerned that there was no real science that demonstrated how many could be taken. You know, what is the sustainable yield? That you're just catching whales all the time and reducing the population, or is the population infinite? How do we know? So Canada took a young seal biologist, Dr. Mike Bigg, and tasked him with, okay, Mike, tell us how many killer whales are in the Salish Sea, or at least in the Canadian waters. And he decided that his approach would be to put up posters and send out postcards to marinas and coastal towns and post offices and request everybody to participate in something like a Christmas bird count, when one day a year you count up all the birds that you see in the neighborhood and add it all together, subtract the number that you think that you know, two neighbors saw at the same time. Anyway, he sent these out, and in August, I think it was 1973, received a number of reports and found that one of the hotspot areas was up in Johnstone Strait. And he basically came up with about 280 whales total in the population. And he reported this to Ottawa, the federal government in Canada. And in order to dress up the report a little bit, he decided to add some pictures. And he went to Johnstone Strait and took some photographs and sent that off to Ottawa also. And the capture industry was somewhat taken aback that, whoa, there are a lot more than that. You know, the day before or the day after your count, you could have had many more. And so the government asked him to do it again. He did it the following year, 74, I believe. And he went back to Johnstone Strait he got the same number, basically, 280 some whales. Went back up to Johnstone Strait, took some more photographs, and noticed that, by golly, some of them looked awful similar to the ones he saw the previous year. And he looked at them carefully and said, well, they're the same whales. So this light bulb went off in his head that we can tell them apart. We can individually recognize these whales. So why don't we just photograph all of them and count up the number of pictures, and then we know how many whales are there. So he did that. And basically, by 1975, he had a pretty thorough catalog of both northern resident killer whales that came into Johnstone Strait and southern resident killer whales that were basically around the Victoria, Strait of Juan de Fuca, Haro Strait area. He wanted to keep this study going, but the government had their answer, basically. They had the number of whales and closed the captures. There weren't enough to have the harvest sustainable at the rate that was going on. And our government, the United States, in the following year, well, late in 75, actually, they decided that they had to have their own number, you know, because there was a border between the US and Canada, and maybe some of them were a different bunch on the US side. So they tasked me to go out and tell us how many whales are in the United States waters. And they initiated the contract on April Fool's Day, 1976. I was the fool that bid on it and won the contract, and went out, and the first thing we did was, I think it was April 6th or 8th, 1976, ran into a bunch of whales west of where I am right now, Port Angeles. Actually, we encountered them off of Port Angeles and followed them to the west and photographed them. And that night, I called up Mike Bigg. I sketched little pictures of each one of them too, and we processed the film that night. And I called Mike, and I started describing some of these whales, and then he described the others that were with them. He knew them so well that once, we had the famous K1 Taku with the 2 notches in his fin. He was there. And then Mike described the others that were with him. We had L8, he was there. He has that bite at the bottom on the trailing edge of the fin. And he described the other whales that were with him. So I became a believer almost instantly in the individual recognition technique of counting up whales. Then April 16th, we saw a whole different bunch of whales going into Puget Sound and through Admiralty Inlet, and photographed them. And I thought, oh boy, we got some that Mike hadn't seen yet. And the first one I sent him a picture of was J1, and he told me it was J1. Well, J2's there, and J3's there, and J4's there, and J5's there, J6, J7. He just went through the list. We had about a dozen whales, 13, I think. And there was a new little baby. And Mike got real excited, and then I did too, that, hey, what we can do is see how long it takes for this baby to grow up, little J15, and see what his life is like as he goes through his stages of development. So Mike and I decided right then and there that, hey, we're gonna do this for a number of years until we find out how long it takes for a whale to grow up, when they start having babies, and then how long they live, and again, some of the dynamics that were just not available from a simple count. So we both decided we're going to do this, and neither the U.S. or the Canadian government was interested in that part. They just wanted to know a number so they could calculate a sustainable yield for the harvest, and the yield that was sustainable was 0. So captures stopped, and we continued, but without funding. So Mike, on his holidays, kept track of the northern residents, and in the summer months, we sold buttons and t-shirts, and I worked in the winter to save up some money to buy gas and so on and pay the moorage, and we continued. And for some reason or other, we continued this. I mean, it was fascinating. It was biology. It was like about, this was initiated in a harvest sort of response scenario, but really the driving force was the curiosity about the biology, the dynamics, the demographics. First, the population started increasing because primarily young whales. And so they were basically taking all of the youth in the population. When that stopped, then we started being able to watch whales grow up. And people wondered, well, they start having babies when they're 5 or when they're 8, or how old are they? And by the 80s, 1980s, we had already figured out that, hey, well, these are pretty long-lived animals, and they don't really change very much. The young ones grow up fairly fast, but after 5, 6, 7 years, they're still young whales. And it wasn't until the late 80s we published in the International Whaling Commission's scientific papers the data on the young whales grow up and mature, sexually mature by about 13 and a half on average. And using techniques that are used in the life insurance industry to look at survival, we estimated they had a average lifespan of females on the average more than 52 years of age, and males had on the average 29 years of lifespan. And females could live into the 80s and males probably into their 50s. So this was kind of groundbreaking biology that was available from relatively simple technique of individual recognition. Anyway, in the late, well, 1995, 6, 7, we started having some die-offs, and the population had reached almost 100 whales, and then dramatically, within a few years, lost 20% of the population. And the public again began to protest in the sense of, you know, we have to do something about these. Are not just marine mammals that are threatened, they're endangered. And they were listed, proposed for listing, and then listed in 2005 as an endangered species, an endangered population. So we began to get some endangered species funding to monitor the population after that point. And we have annually since then provided the government with a very precise number that in order to calibrate between the northern and the southern residents, usually the studies up there were done, all the whales would be coming in Johnstone Strait and be identified by July. So July 1st was a number that they used for the population estimate date. And to be consistent, we did the same thing in the US waters. Sometimes we don't see the whales by July 1st, and this year may be one of the examples. The last several years, we have not seen them by July 1st, but our report isn't due until October 1st. So if we see them in August and September, we can, you know, if a whale is alive then, it was, unless it's a brand new baby, it was probably alive, well, it was definitely alive July 1st. So we would give our report in the fall as to what the population was on July 1st. So, you know, we get those requests now that everybody wants instant gratification in the news. And, you know, we may not know by July 1st how many are here until they show up in August. So just that was a little backup explanation of why I can't tell you right now exactly how many are there, but we have seen J, K, and L pod fragments over the course of this year so far a couple of times. And our friends and colleagues have sent some photographs from, for example, recently K-pod off of Eureka a couple of weeks ago. I mean, all this is on Orca Network, so you can keep track. And then just the other day, we had J-pod off of Tofino on the west coast of Vancouver Island. But we had also had several complete encounters of J-pod earlier in the spring, so we're pretty sure they're all there. Well, we're definitely sure. And there were no babies yet in that bunch. There have been no babies in K-pod in quite a number of years. And what was it, just 2 years ago, we had a baby in L-pod. But in general, the alarming situation now is that reproduction is failing in this population. They're just, it's worse than captures. You're not having births. And if even when you are, you have, for example, J35 Telequa or whatever we call her, really stole the show by demonstrating her grief and the situation with these whales just dramatically for 17 days, pushed her for at least 1,000 miles, pushed that little calf on her nose. And it just astonished everybody. And you know, that's the message. They can't speak Canadian or English American or any language other than their own calls and clicks, which we don't know anything about what they're saying. But by her actions, she showed us what they're hurting from. As there is no reproduction left in the population, and that means extinction. And the reason that they're having this problem with reproduction is nutritional stress and the toxic fluids in their body that are being metabolized by their fat that influence their success in bringing a gestation to fruition. They're starving. They need fish. They need salmon. They need Chinook salmon particularly. And humans have basically stolen their food, and we're continuing to do that. And worse yet, what's happening is we're not even allowing the salmon to reproduce. For crying out loud, we have rivers and streams all around the Salish Sea that formerly, up until the beginning of the last century, were amazingly productive of Chinook salmon, all species of salmon. It was one of the natural wonders that the explorers who came here hundreds of years ago took back to their countries with this. Just the bounty is unbelievable. Millions upon millions upon millions of fish returning to rivers to spawn, and then they die, and the young fish hatch out of eggs in the river and retrace the life cycle of the species, heading out to sea. Most of them go out the Strait of Juan de Fuca from the Salish Sea and turn right and go up to Southeast Alaska to mature, and return, in the case of Chinook, 4 years, 5 years, and sometimes 6 or 7 years after leaving, and come back as big fish, 30, 40, 70, 100-pound salmon that were available in incredible abundance. The Fraser River was a huge producer of these salmon. All the rivers in Puget Sound also contributed. And then the Columbia had 12 million of these salmon returning until we dammed it. We dammed the rivers in the 60s. I remember Howie and I were in high school when they were talking about damming the Snake, the upper reaches of the Columbia River system. All this was going on. It was progress. It was, producing electricity. It was providing transportation for farmers to bring their grain and wheat products out of the eastern Washington, Idaho, eastern Oregon area to the markets around the world. It was human progress, but it was hugely damaging to the salmon populations. They're just slight remnants of what they used to be. And you probably heard that we at Center for Whale Research and Orca Network and all the orca advocates, orca salmon folks have raised our voices about the Snake River dams. There in one fell swoop, you could basically return large numbers of salmon to the ecosystem and make them available to not only fishermen, but to primarily the whales. We have to rethink our utilization of natural resources and provide for the natural ecosystem first and foremost. I know that a lot of people are dependent upon these fish for a livelihood. We have a limited population, a limited resource. We have to be very careful that we provide the natural ecosystem and the natural predators, the southern residents, their requirements before we take any more. It can be done. Change has to happen all around our society. This COVID thing is something that gives us all a huge pause. But if we look at this, a large part of our motivation in this pandemic is for our personal survival. But what we better look in the long run is for ecosystem survival and rearrange our industries and our resource exploitations to support that survival. And these whales don't have that much time remaining for them to start reproducing. Only a few of the females are now able to reproduce. A lot of them are reaching their menopause. They're not going to have any more babies after that. They're still going to eat. They won't have their role as grandmothers. They'll just be mouths to feed, which is sad. We don't want to have to count them to zero, but that's clearly where it's going if we don't change our ways. That's all I have. I mean, maybe I didn't talk long enough, but if we got questions, we can deal with it. Oops, 13 questions. How do we do that?
You want to hit Q&A and take a look at that?
And we can read those to you, Ken, if that would be easier for you, and that way you can just concentrate on
Okay, yeah, read to me.
answers. Okay,
I mean,
I think
I can see
Amanda's
it.
gonna run with that, so I'll just let her take that on.
Okay, you take that on. Tell me, what's the question?
Okay, so I'm going to start with some, we do have some questions on Toki, but since I've got you on the line here, the first one says, has there ever been a scientific explanation for the big gap in life expectancy? And I'm not sure if that's between male and female orca. This was a question by Eva. I don't know if Eva's still on and might be able to clarify that question for me.
Well, that's a good one right there, though.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I'm assuming that it's the difference between male and female life expectancy. Well, I mean, everybody knows males are kind of only useful for one thing. They do in a whale society, they dive deeper and they do move the big fish that are from the bottom that travel along deeper waters. They'll move them up toward the surface, and usually it's a female that nails it and shares it with the rest of the family, including, as we now know, her son, who's doing the deep diving for him. And he's not the mate. He may be the mate of somebody else, but I mean, we've done this demographic study based on photo identification, but the studies that have been done with the genetic work in terms of at first biopsies, but we kind of complained about that a little bit because they didn't really like you shooting darts at them. But you can, from a fecal sample, get the DNA of the whale and of the fish and any hormones. You get all kinds of information from them. And we now know that only a relatively few males over age 20 in general, and the older they get, the smarter they are in terms of mating with the females, or the more attractive. For example, we had 2 males, L41 and J1, were fathering most of the calves in the past 20 years or 25 years. That's pretty remarkable. What do the rest of them do? You know, I mean, basically herd the fish, move up, and you know, they get fed by monsters of fish. But basically, if they run through a time of lack of nutrition, they're expendable, except for the breeders. So probably is Mother Nature's way in just setting up what's the life history requirements for male and female. Yeah, and then they have to babysit for the rest of their life. And the males can be around to father calves, but they're not necessarily fathering calves. Well, they're definitely not usually in their own matron lines or even in their own pods. They're usually fathering outside of the social group that they're traveling with. Anyway, they're basically more expendable than females. Females are going to be the saviors of this population if it can happen. Long-winded, sorry.
Well, thanks. I have another question here. It says, what is the typical schedule of orca migration on the western seaboard, and how far south will they travel?
Okay, and I suppose everybody can hear the question, so it's not necessary for me to repeat it. But basically, what we would find is that from May till October, November in the early years, the whales were around, southern resident killer whales were in the Salish Sea area almost daily, certainly weekly, and all of them. So, and this was when we had runs going to all the rivers in the Salish Sea area, that if the Duwamish wasn't producing a big run that year, maybe the another Puget Sound river was, or the Fraser, which was really the big horse of the area, was every year producing lots of salmon returning for spawn. So that brought the whales back. The summer Chinook in particular brought them back in May. And then in winter months, you'd have winter runs in coastal rivers and all the way down to California, Monterey, California, and all the way up to Southeast Alaska. You'd have feeders, big schools of salmon that were in their 3rd year or 4th year that were feeding prior to the return to their spawning river. And so they would travel, they'll go where the fish are. And that's always what they've done. And they will follow the biggest runs.
All right. So I have another question here. It says, has there been any extended observation work? Meaning, has any organization stayed with any members of the southern residents for extended periods of time? They have in parentheses weeks or months without leaving them to get more thorough observations and understand behavior.
Well, I guess it's over. Your question's over. It was a little, the sound was a little warbly there at times, but in the late 70s, we followed them as much as 36, 40 hours, through a night and part of another night, and then we'd lose track of them somewhere in the middle of the night. But, they have been satellite tagged, and those tracks show movements. Basically, we found right off the bat, and the satellite also shows it, that they travel about 75 miles a day. They could go from the Strait of Juan de Fuca to San Francisco in a week. And they could go up to, we had the same sort of thing from photo ID stuff where they'd be in Southeast Alaska and 2 weeks later we'd have them in Puget Sound. So they're very, very much travelers, and they're looking for salmon throughout the range, and salmon were throughout the range in great numbers. They're just not available to them now, and unfortunately they're pretty much focused on the salmon as being the most nutritious food available. But they're survivors. They're eating other stuff too. It's just not giving them the catch per unit effort, the energy. Like you can run around and try and catch lettuce and eat it all the time and might fill your stomach, but you're not going to survive very long.
All right, I'll ask the next question. I think Amanda was having a few connection issues with her computer. But the next one says, hi, and thank you so much for doing this. Just curious, was L87 seen in Tofino recently with J-Pod? If not, on last report, do you know which matriline he was seen traveling with?
That's a very good question. We've had several encounters with the complete J-Pod in the spring, and we have not seen L87. And I do not know, I haven't received all the pictures yet from Tofino, but my guess is that he was probably not also seen then. And who he's traveling with, if he's still alive, we have no idea. He's been obviously in L-Pod, K-Pod, and J-Pod, and he may have run out of options.
All right, so the next one could be for Susan and Howie or Ken, either one, but it has to do with COVID. There were a couple questions on this, and do we think that that is decreasing noise pollution in the Salish Sea with less boats out there? So whoever feels like they would like to answer that.
Well, I have if I hate to jump in on that one,
No,
except
please.
that I do have, I don't know, we could call it a bias, I guess. But I've seen these whales travel through these waters in incredible ambient noise levels. I've watched the bowling hydrofoils, the military hydrofoils, the ferries drive right over them. And, there are recordings of whales now that have had little recording packs on their back that are receiving these noise levels, and they are being analyzed. We never observed any significant long-term effects or changes in behavior from vessel noise. They definitely were catching fish in high ambient noise environments. And this, the COVID thing's great for people that like to record whales if you don't have much small vessel traffic around. Most of that is high frequency noise, or relatively high frequency, above 3 kilohertz, 3 to 10 or 12. And then, you have less of that racket, which right now, most of what we're talking, the frequency range of our usual communication between people is, 3 kilohertz. That's what the phone systems are basically peaking at. There's no sense sending a lot of high frequency information if you're not using it. And the same with low frequency. It's out there in the ambient world, but the frequencies that are used by whales to echolocate fish are primarily in the 22 kilohertz focus, and the frequencies that are used for their communication, talking back and forth, is roughly in the same frequency range as our voice, 1 to 3 kilohertz. And they say the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. So I think they've basically evolved to have as Bill Cheville used to call it, the most monotonous conversationalist. But, you know, if you don't hear it once, then you maybe hear it on the 10th time. And it may not have that much communication other than, I'm here, I'm over here, you know, I'm okay, I'm still with you. And they can hear within a 17-mile range, I'm sure, maybe 30 miles, so that a traveling pod can be, you know, separated by great distances and still be traveling together.
Did you have anything you wanted to add to that in terms of COVID and how it might be affecting folks or whales?
Well, I don't think we can attribute any changes in whale behavior to any noise levels. You know, they've been absent, but so have the fish. So that's the primary problem. So no, I would just concur with what Ken said.
And the transients have been around.
Yeah. Yeah. Fortunately,
Right.
Mother Nature had this beautiful system of and we certainly still have a lot of transients around, and they chat too, but not as often.
All right, so there's a lot of really great questions. Thank you, everybody. And we'll just keep going as long as you want to stick around until our panelists get tired. So we'll just keep going with them if that's good with everybody. So the next question is, what does the future of orca research in the Salish Sea look like? Are there specific fields that are expanding or seem to need additional research?
Gosh, I guess I can shoot at that one too, but I hate to hog this thing. But basically, the transients are coming back. You know, when we first started, I think we only had about a half a dozen transient encounters, and several of them were the same group, OPOD, we called them. They've since been given T numbers. So the transient studies, they can continue, and basically we can look at the demographic vigor and dynamics of that bunch, which would be an interesting comparison to the residents. They are related, but they're at least 70,000 years distantly genetically related, probably more than that. So they're not quite as different as us and chimpanzees, but they're maybe us and Neanderthals, you know, but whatever. That's a study. The study of, you know, the acoustic world is still fascinating, and nobody's yet got the key to what are they saying. Then drone work that we're doing, social networking. I mean, it's really quite fascinating. And, you know, they are a social species. It's interesting to see that unlike our species, they don't seem to have protests and wars and battles with one another. They get along. Sometimes they just get along by avoiding each other, but that's still getting along. It's not malicious. Howie and Susan, you guys, I'm going to just keep my mouth shut on the next few.
Well, I'll ask one specifically for Howard and Susan next then. So the next one is, would you give an update on Tokitai's possible chance of going back to the ocean?
Yeah, okay, well, I'll give it a try. And I can't, really. I cannot give a probability exactly, except to say that our work has not been done overall, the big community, in terms of doing what needs to be done to bring her back. I think we, over the 25 years since actually Ken started the Lolita campaign in 1995, the world has changed in terms of attitudes toward orcas or whales and dolphins in captivity. And I think it's an industry on the decline. The spectacle, the circus acts, they're just not popular as they were, and there's a huge negativity toward them. And I'd say it's universally agreed with anyone I talk to that Tokitai Lolita in Miami, an L-pod whale captured in 1970 on Penn Cove, needs to come home. Everybody pretty much agrees on that. The problem is there is a huge opposition from the industry, basically coming from the marine park industry historically, going back 50 years, to the idea that any of their collection, as they call them, could never leave, can never go back to the ocean. And so they rationalize that with a huge amount of justifications about how they just wouldn't survive, that they're spoiled, that they've gotten market quality fish and professional medical services, and they're used to their routines and they wouldn't remember how to live. And so that has permeated the public, but also the scientific community, a lot of them. The marine mammal scientists, to a large degree, have been intertwined and influenced by the marine park industry. From the park industry hosting the conferences, the biennial conferences, to hiring people, to just sort of, influencing what is possible. And they are very determined, the industry people who are very good at public relations, in keeping anybody from having any conversation that might include ever putting a whale or dolphin back. It's extremely difficult to get a sort of a fair, fact-based conversation with most marine mammal scientists. I'm not saying all, there are certainly some exceptions, like Ken, but an awful lot of them are just averse to that. They just don't want to touch the topic. And so we cannot really get a lot of scientific support that we need for the notion, the idea that she can come home. I mean, that was true 25 years ago. We knew it was a long shot, but it is still true today. And without that scientific consensus, without endorsements, agreements, and participation in the project by a range of, established career marine mammal scientists, it's very hard to ever convince a judge, for instance. And so all the lawsuits have failed because the judges just don't see a remedy. Or, if it should progress to the point of, okay, there's a date set, we're going to bring her back, that would require a permit or some kind of approval. It's kind of unprecedented, so it's not sure exactly what kind of approval, but National Marine Fisheries Service, the federal agencies would weigh in. And they, of course, are very much influenced by the marine park industry historically. I mean, we've been involved in this for 25 years. And, we've seen just a lot of sort of interchange between the agencies, the scientific community, and the industry, and dogged determination by the industry that they are not going to approve of any whale or dolphin ever going back in the ocean. So that bias against the idea of ever doing it is really the main roadblock right now to Toki coming home.
And I would just like to add that, what has given us more hope the last few years is the involvement of the Lummi Nation, because they, as a, their own federal entity, basically are on the same level as NOAA Fisheries. So as far as permission, permits, different ways that they can take legal actions, like through the Graves and Repatriation Act, and just the way their culture sees whales, which is, you know, the way we would like our culture to see them more, and it wouldn't be so hard. You know, so their participation and involvement could help in that manner, we are hoping.
All right, I'm going to try to jump on here again. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. So there are a few questions that I'm actually going to pull together and pose, since they are all running the same theme here. I've had a couple people ask, of Ken specifically, what do you think about whale watching? And it says, and its impact along with the rest of the boats on this issue with southern residents and salmon. How big does it impact, or how little does it impact? And then another one regarding boats in here was, do you think that the whale watch moratorium would be beneficial in this case?
Yeah, well, I just read that and typed an answer to it, and I'll speak it. I don't think the moratorium on whale watching per se is helpful to the whales at all. It's basically respectful, professional whale watching has gone a long way in helping us look at the distribution and status of the southern resident killer whales. And, you know, basically, the whale watching community knows the whales quite well. The vessel part is, you know, you have to be courteous and respectful that you are in their environment and not to overrun them. For example, in the early years of Orca Survey, one of the ways that people thought they could see a whale up close was to chase it and drive real fast around it and make it stop and then take a picture of it. And, you know, Jacques Cousteau had this circle of confusion technique that he used on television in the 1960s. So people had that sort of idea that, well, gee, that's how to see a whale up close. A lot of other people, you know, they just were going from point to point at high speed, and they didn't even know whales were there, and they drive right over them, or, you know, basically, to all appearance, they'd be, oh God, they're going to hit a whale, they're going to hurt the whale. Oh, the poor whales, it hurts their ears. Oh, stop, stop. But the whales have not been adversely affected by that. We've never seen a prop scar on a southern resident killer whale. We have seen one that, it was K25, rambunctious little guy. You know, he went racing along with a bunch of his buddies, and they were chasing each other, having a great time. And he came up under a boat and hit the skeg of the outboard that was stopped, and took a divot out of his back, and he's healed up since then. But that's the only incidents that we've seen of an actual impact. Anyway, I don't think, you know, the moratorium is, it's a feel-good thing that has absolutely no value to the whales. It has a negative value in the sense of lost information about their distribution and occupancy of the Salish sea waters. It's the ostrich approach: bury your head in the sand. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for us. We have to see the whales to take their picture.
All right, so to piggyback off of that one, someone asked you, Ken, what would you say the biggest threat to the orcas is over the next 5 to 10 years? Is it nutritional stress, as you highlighted?
The biggest threat to these orcas is nutritional stress. We must allow them to have sufficient food supplies to survive. I mean, we know from the drone photographic data that Dr. John Durbin and Dr. Holly Fernbeck are doing, that these whales are skinnier. Our southern residents are skinnier than the transients by far, and skinnier than the northern residents that are further north. And I did see a question about how come the ones up north are doing so much better? And the reason is, I pointed out that, you know, from the Columbia River and the Salish Sea, every fish that leaves the stream in which it was spawned turns right and goes to Southeast Alaska to feed and forage. And the Gulf of Alaska is basically the area where there's plenty of food. It's cold, mixed water, sunlight in the summer that is hugely productive. And that's where the fish are. And that's where the other populations get first dibs. You know, it was back like it should be, where you had fish in the whole ecosystem and all up and down the coast in sufficient numbers, you would have the southern residents doing fine. But that's where, again, the Snake River really comes in, is that was a huge contribution to the Chinook resources on the continental shelf of Washington State, Vancouver Island, and Southeast Alaska. It, you know, until we restore those salmon resources, there is no chance for these whales just to recover.
All right, thanks. I'm going to combine two questions here too. The first is, do we know who J56's father is? And then the second is, how long between sightings is it before a whale is considered to be deceased?
Both of those are excellent questions. And no, we don't know who J56's father is. We have to wait until the fecal sample is collected, or hopefully not a necropsy. But at that point, we'd be able to determine the DNA and match up who's the father in the population. Let's see, and what was the second part? There was...
How many absences before they're considered deceased?
That's kind of a subjective kind of thing. It's you know, the L87, if he were a J-pod whale all along, I'd call him dead already. But he demonstrated this, you know, basically he's very opportunistic. He needs a adult female to kind of be the mother, not a sex partner, but somebody that, you know, he'll chase the fish up and she'll catch it and share it with him. You know, that's the way it works. And that's the way grandmas are good at that kind of stuff, because, you know, they basically have a lot of experience. And so he attached themselves to older females for, you know, when his mom died, he was in L-pod for a while, and then he went over to K-pod and K13 and what was the other one? But
K7, I think.
Yeah, K7 and then K13. Yeah, so you know, he likes these. We call them Harold and Maude. You know, he likes these old girls, but the reason is, I'm sure, that that's who would tolerate and team with him in catching fish. And then J2 did. And then she's gone, you know. So now what does he do? He hung around for a while. He was with J19 for a while. But, you know, now, you know, I don't know where he is. He wasn't with K-pod. He wasn't with J-pod. And has he gone back and found an old girl in L-pod? I don't know. Hopefully we'll know sometime this summer. And I think we'll give him this year to, if we don't see him, he's gone. But he's definitely an atypical animal. Usually 3 or 4 encounters that are considered complete with a pod and a whale is missing is enough to call him dead.
All right, so I have another question here. It says, have you seen any new patterns in the southern residents, where they are, or is it too short of a time period of change? Have you noticed behavior changes, meaning are they spread out more when they do come into the Salish Sea?
And I don't know what time frame you're talking, just about COVID or about recent years, but I will say that in the 1970s through 80s, the southern resident killer whales went into Puget Sound twice a month, almost year round. Winter months, they weren't there as much, but in the summer months, they were down there. They were down there for Seafair every August. And that was like, wow, do they like the excitement going on, or, you know, the Blue Angels or what? You know, they were down there in incredible traffic jams of boats and aircraft and people doing everything, twice a month. They hardly ever go there anymore, and they're going there now for the chum runs in the fall, late fall, winter. So mostly the distribution changes have been absences. They're just not coming around, and when they do, it may not be the whole pod. It may only be a matriline, and typically they're very spread out, whereas they used to be, you know, at least during the course of a day, you'd have everybody gathering together in a pretty tight group, in an resting group, and basically they would synchronously surface and breathe, and you know, somebody was keeping track where they were going, and if you're respectful of you know, not driving over them when they're doing that, they don't care. They're just doing their social thing or their rest thing, and then they come out of it and they go hunting for fish again. It was very exciting patterns to watch, but those patterns are gone. They're all spread out and they're very seldom here.
All right, so I'm going to combine two more. There's one that asks about LPOD that was sighted off of Monterey, California. And then there's another one about the more recent encounter off of Eureka. And the questions are basically, does it seem likely that they're finding Chinook or other fish species in those areas that they can feed on for sustenance? And is this new territory for them?
Well, to start at the end, it's not new territory. We've, for the past 20 years, seen the Ks and Ls at least go as far as Monterey, California. And there have been prey samples collected off Eureka by Jeff Jacobson. And they were showing salmon in the prey sample. So I'm pretty sure that they're traveling. The Sacramento-San Joaquin River system was a big salmon producer. It still produces salmon, and those salmon are basically coastal in their foraging habits. You know, you don't have to just eat salmon that are returning to spawn. You can eat salmon that are pretty good size, that are out there in schools that are feeding in productive waters, and those waters are productive. Out here off of the Cape Flattery and the Olympic Peninsula, there's amazingly productive waters, and they feed out there. They're out there a fair amount. That's part of what the satellite tagging showed. And I don't know, it's not a dig really, but it happens to coincide with a naval training area, the Northwest Training Complex, in which, you know, 105 bombs are dropped every year. 5% of them are active. You know, torpedoes, you know, all kinds of military action going on out there. And, you know, we can take L-112 that died, you can check me on what year, but basically she died during an exercise in that area. And she died of a blunt force trauma. I wouldn't let the militaries of Canada and the US be off the hook on that one. I mean, obviously it happens. I don't know, you know, J-34 died of a blunt force trauma after he went through a torpedo range, for crying out loud, you know, and you blame it on a ferry or a whale watcher. Nobody knows, but there's a certain coincidence to being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we're putting up wrong places here and there and everywhere.
All right, so you touched on salmon in Alaska just a little bit, but I do have a couple questions regarding movements for Southern residents. And the first was, would the Southern residents ever move permanently to such a location as Alaska? And then the secondary question is, why wouldn't Southern residents travel to the area where Northern residents are if there is more food in that area?
The answers are they do travel to those areas. Our colleague, Brian Gisborne, has seen at Swiftsure Bank, right here at the entrance of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Southern residents feeding along the upwelling at the southern boundary of Swiftsure Bank, and the Northern residents feeding just a few hundred yards away at the northern boundary. They don't mix. They don't. They seem to sort of know, well, this is my food area, and that's your food area. The Southern residents do go as far as Alaska. J-Pod was heading north off to Fino the other day. I don't know if they end up going to Alaska, but they could very well go all the way around Vancouver Island and come back through Johnstone Strait, and maybe we'll hear the Orca Lab report that they hear Southern residents on their hydrophones. You know, the beauty of this system is knowing individuals and actually knowing their vocalizations, that you can have a consortium or a communication amongst the researchers and keep pretty good track of where they are. I mean, it's really quite remarkable, given that currently they don't need to have satellite transmitters on their back, and that actually was something that was injurious to them. And L95 died from it. So we don't want to have that kind of invasive procedure if we don't need it. But anyway, they'll go there. They just, why they don't fight about it, I don't know. But apparently the Southern residents know that, you know, their turf is down here, Salish Sea and coastal waters of California, Oregon, Washington. And that used to support probably 200 whales or more, same as the Northern resident. Seems like whale populations kind of peak out in their feeding areas at about 300 individuals, and then they have to have another feeding area.
All right, so these next few questions are for all three of you. There are quite a few in here asking about what people that are listening into the webinar today can do to support the scientific community, to support Southern residents on a whole. What can we do about salmon? Are there other industries that need to be addressed other than the Snake River dams, such as fishing, logging? What changes specifically could any of you suggest for those who are tuning in with us today that want to be able to help?
Good one. That's a really broad question, and it isn't just one act. I don't think. You know, it's a sort of a steady flow of expressions, and that can be during comment periods to federal agencies or state. Or it can be any way that you can express your dedication to helping save these orcas and the reasons why. There are other industries that need to be aware. You know, we've been arguing Cindy and Ken and all of us for some kind of quota, some kind of provision for the orcas in the fishing limits. Basically, it's a very complex problem. There's a commercial and recreational, there's tribal, there's all sorts of Canadian and US and all sorts of different jurisdictions involved. And so it's very hard to find consensus. Besides, fishing communities tend to be very independent. So that's not easy to accomplish in short order, but that's the kind of thing. And yes, of course, habitat destruction, logging, damming. The Chehalis River Dam now is very controversial, and Cindy has been in the forefront of informing and acting on that to keep a proposed dam on the Chehalis from being built. So there are just a lot of small and some very large issues that are not that hard to find. We make note of them in our whale reports and on our website and Facebook page, and so do many other organizations. So it's not one simple thing. It's more like a lifestyle. It's more like a dedication that you see the opportunities and go with them. Susan, did you have any additions?
So I couldn't hear the question because I have my sound turned off so it doesn't echo.
All right, so it was pretty broad. I just tried to take a couple questions that were in here and combine them, and they were mostly surrounding how folks that were listening in today could support the scientific community, how they could support Southern residents, or what some actions would be, and what industries might be able to be, I guess, maybe written to or kind of be under the spotlight for things that could change that would help the Southern residents and the salmon.
Okay, well, I have a few things to add. Number one is to report whale sightings, because that helps provide data for the researchers. When researchers are able to be out on the water, it often we're able to let the researchers know so they can go get their fecal samples or do IDs and see who's there, who's missing. It also, through everyone's sightings, it's turned into this citizen science project where a lot of information we have seen, just the trends over the almost 20 years we've been doing this, have research has proven this, but we can see the trends in the sightings we get of the changes in Southern residents coming in or not, or the increase in transients, the increase in humpback, finding the gray whales that might not be doing well during this current unusual mortality. We also turning in stranded marine mammals, dead or live stranded mammals, to either the NOAA Washington hotline or to the local regional stranding network. The network covers Island and Skagit County, and a lot of the work we're doing with porpoise strandings, we have detected some of the same fungus that's showing up in orcas. We had an index case for Cryptococcus gattii being transferred from a porpoise to her unborn fetus. So there are things we're discovering, and we're also right now doing, it's not on, well, it's on porpoise and seals. We're doing an antibiotic resistance study and finding all kinds of, antibiotic resistant bacteria in seals and porpoise. And our marine mammal vet, Stephanie Norman, is just wrapping that up, and will be writing up a summary of that and publishing a paper. So, whale sightings, marine mammal strandings, and talking to your neighbors and your friends and people at work, just sharing the word. The more we can make people aware. And then the other thing that we have been doing and want to do more of is getting out the Be Whale Wise information and working with marinas to just educate boaters and get them interested in whales so that they want to be better boaters around whales. A lot of people just don't even know there are whales out there. I mean, a lot of the worst offenders we see in Puget Sound are people who don't even realize, especially if it's a gray or a humpback, that often you don't happen to see them spout or their back or their fluke. You may not even know they're there. So that's, just being a courteous and educated boater and helping to educate others. And I guess lastly, especially in these times of such angst and violence and bullying and polarization in so many areas of our country, and we've seen it in the orca world for decades. And, we're seeing more of it now, especially around the boating and whale watching issue, to be kind and compassionate and try to educate kindly and understand that we aren't all going to agree on every issue about the orcas. And we can try to share our viewpoints, but to try to be somewhat open-minded and understand people will have different ideas, and to share our ideas and opinions with each other in a kind way, because we all at heart, no matter what we think, really all want the same for the whales. We want the southern residents to survive for generations ahead, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done for that to happen, and us fighting with each other isn't going to help it. So Ken, you probably have more to add.
Well, I think I've talked enough, but yeah, I'd like to, I don't know if I can share a screen of a movie for a few minutes. It sort of talks about the vessel issue. Let's see, there we go. Yeah, I can highlight it and I can share it, and we'll see if it, I am screen sharing. What happens here? Oh, I guess I have to push play. There's a whale chasing a fish. It can, well, I guess I'll just let it play. This is up in Johnstone Strait. Playing in the stern waves of a vessel going at 25 knots. Here's an underwater view of it. Notice how effortlessly the whales were swimming at that speed. Of course, they're riding the draft of this vessel. And you'll notice little undulations in the body. What they're doing is basically their skin and blubber depresses under the pressure waves of water going past, and sheds them, makes a laminar, takes a turbulent flow and makes it laminar. And they're riding in the jacuzzi, looking at getting a little pressure. It's like a hot tub pressure jet. And these little pressure waves are traveling not just in the immediate vicinity of the props, which are cavitating bubbles, but they're all around. They radiate out from the props. So even the whales at 10 or 15 feet away, 20 feet away, are still feeling the pressure waves. So that's all. I think they like some boats.
All right, quick question, Ken. A couple questions came in about the video. They're wondering what this video was from, and was this being shared from Center for Whale Research or somewhere else?
This video was taken probably 15 years ago from a whale watch vessel in Johnstone Strait. At least that's what I was led to believe. It was filmed by a German cinematographer. It was shared with me by DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans. They were well aware of the behavior of these whales toward at least this vessel. And we're not sharing it any further. We just thought we'd throw this in as a little treat for those that stuck around here long enough to see the end of this show.
All right, so a couple questions here ask why satellite tags are harmful to the whales, and then what your take on them is personally, Ken.
See, I don't know if my face shows up and these fingers show up, but the barbs that hold the tag to the whale are 3 inches long, roughly. They're sterilized. There's 4 of them, 3 of them, 4 of them. Depends on the tag configuration. But it's slapped on the back of a whale, punctures through into the blubber. Any puncture through the integument or the skin is has the possibility of introducing whatever contaminants and bugs you might have on your skin. In this case, in the case of L95, it was a fungus. I had warned the National Marine Fisheries from the get-go that this is an unsafe procedure. You can sterilize the tag as much as you want before you slap it on the whale, but the whale's skin may be carrying all kinds of stuff that now gets introduced to the bloodstream as a result of being injected into the body. And that is what happened. A fungus was traced from the tag to the heart of L95 and it killed him. So I'm not in favor of, I used to tag whales, for crying out loud, and that's how I got started in whale biology. But and I heard there were complaints about it at that time. I was young, I didn't understand the whole deal, and there were enough surviving whales. I mean, actually, the tags were collected in a whaling enterprise, so it was a very crude way of looking at whale distribution and migratory patterns. You only get one response per tag, if that. Whereas the satellite tag at least offered a number of pings. You could get 300 or 400 positions out of it. But it was still injurious and potentially lethal, and it did kill a whale, and they're too endangered for me to advocate that technique. It's no longer necessary. The photo ID and the acoustic work is showing us most of what we need to know. And most of what we need to know is they got to eat, feed them. We give them some abundant food supplies and they'll respond. I have no doubt about it.
All right, so I think we're going to do a couple more. I know that there are a lot of questions that are still open in the Q&A, but we do want to wrap it up so that everybody can get back to their evening as well. And we appreciate everybody that's still in the webinar. We're going to try to find a way to, maybe if your question didn't get answered, to shoot us an email, and we'll see if we can get those answered the best that we can moving forward. But so one question in here that's great, and if all 3 of you have advice, please weigh in. But it says, for someone very interested in having a marine conservation career, what is a good place to start, and what type of degree would be best for that?
Howie or Susan, you want to take it? He's muted there.
All right, there's 3 ways to do it. I finally figured it out. But the entry into the field can come from many directions. The careers are hard to find. You know, I mean, become informed. Basically, study all you can. If there's coursework, classes, anything relevant, marine biology, mammalogy, you know, ecosystem science, all of those are very important. So, you know, become a wealth of information yourself. And there are, you know, internships occasionally. They're rare. There are naturalist positions if whale watching ever starts up again. There are, you know, various ways you can get involved with the conservation organizations. We need volunteers for sightings for the Langley Whale Center whenever that reopens, and for other parts of events and things that we do now and then, for example. But there are a lot of other organizations, and just not a lot of jobs, you know. So make it, you know, a hobby, something, a labor of love, and hopefully you'll be able to find a labor of a career too that will actually work. But it, you know, it would be great if it was a national priority and there were sort of, you know, funded operations and projects to study biology in general. But certainly, you know, whales and dolphins and marine sciences need a lot more overall social support. But, you know, in the meantime, you sort of have to find a niche. That's about all I've got. Anybody?
Well, volunteering is always a good way to get into it, and that often helps get you a job, and it gives you experience to help you know what you want to do, what you enjoy doing, and it just, the more you learn, the more different opportunities you see are out there. But I'm not a marine biologist, and just ended up educating and coordinating, and started, you know, kind of accidentally started the sighting network, and it turned into Orca Network. And so just follow your passion and be persistent, and it, you know, at some point may lead you into a job that takes over your whole life.
All right. So looking through, there are a couple of questions surrounding the Snake River dams, and most of them are asking why they can't currently be taken down, and then what can be done to raise awareness around that issue.
Anybody want to take it? Yeah. I mean, I just approached it from a food thing, you know, like the biggest bang for the buck in possible recovery of salmon was through the Snake River system. You know, 1 million fish, that would far outdo all the Salish Sea runs that could be restored. Not that they shouldn't be, everything should be restored. But here's one fell swoop here where we're basically using taxpayer and ratepayer money to kill salmon and subsidize farm transportation of wheat and crops that can be easily transported on the rails. Might as well subsidize that instead of subsidizing the killing of salmon. It can be done. It's a benign dictator would have those things, they'd start removing them now. They'd be out of there by winter. They don't need to be there. And the fish would start recovering. And the whales would have a chance in the future. I think they can make it for 3 or 4 years, but 10 years from now, with zero reproduction like we're going, not a chance. They're going extinct.
Did either Howie or Susan want to weigh in on that one?
I didn't actually hear the whole question.
Okay.
I was distracted. Could you repeat that, please?
Yes. So I kind of combined a couple of questions, but I think one of the things that hasn't been addressed yet was what can someone do to raise awareness for the lower Snake River dams?
Yeah, well, every way you can. There are, letter writing and petition, movements that you can get involved in. I don't know, it's tough, but what we need are elected representatives. Our governor, our senators, the governor of Oregon has chimed in and supports it. And there are a few other, glimpses of that kind of support from, for instance, Mike Simpson, U.S. rep in Idaho. He cares about fish. That's sort of his focus, and he sees those dams are killing fish. But even he is reluctant to come out and say the dams have to come down. They just can't be clear about it because there is this force of controversy that has been thrown into that issue for so long and so effectively that the backlash, the pushback is awesome. It's formidable for any elected person or anybody who values, sort of their sort of public reputation. So it's tough to give them the okay, to give them permission. I mean, to let them know that they can help. But it helps. I mean, when you do give that kind of support to people, that they balance it, they register that, and so it can have a big effect. Basically, okay, write to your governor and our 2 senators, and that would probably be the most effective, key to turning that tide and getting those dams removed.
All right. So there's one in here that says some marine parks have done studies on how mothers pass pollutants to their calves. Has this research been beneficial to endangered populations like the southern residents?
You want it, Ken?
Sure, yeah. Obviously, any of the detailed research that's been done on captive animals has application in the knowledge that we have of the same species in the wild. So, the rate of actually, there should be more of that captivity studies that are shared with the wild. For years and years and years. When we were talking about initially, Mike Bigg was ridiculed by the aquarium industry for saying that he could tell the whales apart. They're all Shamu. You can't tell them apart. Well, that obviously was not true. Then we said, well, they don't have babies every year like you think they do. And well, it's actually every 5.2 years is our average in the early studies. And that was finally taken as okay. But the information transfer, I mean, just hasn't been a good communication between captive and free ranging studies on killer whales. You know, the Aquaria argue that, hey, we're their family now. They don't need a family out. You know, that this stuff about families in the wild is a fairy tale. Well, no, that's not the case. No, that was, you know, we know that the pollutants from mothers are transferred to the babies largely through the milk, and because largely the toxic substances are lipophilic, or they attach to fats, and the milk is very high and rich in fat. So the baby gets a super dose of toxic substances, in addition to whatever it may have gathered in utero, because the blood was circulating it. And anyway, yeah, we know that it's part of the problem, and the lack of survival and the lack of reproductive success in the gestation of these whales is due to toxins. It's just, and it's there, and those toxins are in their body. They're in their high doses, but basically stored in the blubber, in the fat. And when they metabolize that fat for their nutritional needs, when there's lack of food, then that's when it's a whammy on the babies. It's insidious. If we just kept them well fed for a couple of generations, they could get through it. But we got to start making sure they're well fed.
All right, so to wrap up, I'm going to leave you, all three of you, with a fun one. Someone asked, who is your Oprah? Meaning, if you could have 5 minutes with anyone, a politician, a celebrity, an activist, and give them your best orca pitch, whether it be the Snake River Dams, Toki's Freedom, etc., who would it be?
You guys go for it.
Well, I'm looking for my invitation to be a guest on the Colbert Show. He can ask some really good questions and yet keep it light and be really, really informative, and seems to grasp things and has a huge audience. And I think that he would be my Oprah. Unmute.
Okay, sorry. Trying to be quiet. I would say President Obama, and in my fantasy world where he's still president, if I can be allowed a fantasy, that I would, yeah, Obama would be who I would like to share that with, and hope he would, you know, be in a position to do something. Or Ken Balcomb. Balcom would be he's my Oprah. Although he hasn't given us a car yet, but.
Well, my Oprah right now would be Governor Inslee. You know, I'm not sure, you know, if he would even just listen, you know, that would be wonderful. But I think that he has very selective hearing on this subject of not only I mean, he knows that whales are politically, they're the babies, you know, they're very important to people, but he's spin doctoring it. He has to see what they need, what they truly need, and really take it to heart. I think, you know, he's a good Washingtonian who's looking out, but he's a politician, and he has to somehow put together what, you know, Ralph Monroe was politically, you know, his job was, as Secretary of State, was a political position. He had to get elected, and he found that whales are a great way to do it. But he did it honestly. You don't just use them. You don't ride on them. You take care of them, take them to heart, and do, you know, look at their needs more so than the current needs or the professed needs of your resident humans in the state. The whales are here first, and you should guarantee their survival. You have that chance. So go for it, Governor Inslee.
Well, thanks to the three of you. I think Cindy will probably wrap up, but just to answer someone's question a little bit earlier, they were curious as to how many attendees we had today on the webinar. And at one point when I looked up, I think we were over 160. I don't know if the number was higher than that. I wasn't really keeping my eye too much on that. And then the other thing we wanted to mention was there were quite a few questions regarding captivity and Toki and some of the statuses on those things. And we are going to have a webinar in August on the commemoration date with more information. And that would be an excellent time to tune in for some of the updates and to ask some of the questions that didn't get addressed today for those of you who are interested.
And just to confirm, we did at one point have 162 attendees. So thanks everybody that is still on. We have learned that when we have a webinar with these three, we need to make sure we do 2 hours because there's always going to be a lot of questions. We should have anticipated that. But thank you all so much for all your great questions. And if we did not get a chance to answer them, we apologize, but feel free to email us and we would be happy to try to get answers to those questions for you. So Howard, Susan, Ken, do you have any last thoughts that you want to add to that?
No, if I'm looking at these questions now, and there's some great ones, and I guess if we leave the webinar here, the questions will leave too. But I hope there's a way to have these questions be archived so that we can address them in the future in some way. I mean, this is great. Good questions.
Yeah, I think there's a way that we'll be able to access those through.
Good.
So we'll make sure we get them to the right person to answer.
All right. Well,
You're muted.
I know. And we are recording this also so we can play it back and post the recording of this on our website for people who missed it. And I just want to say thanks to Ken and for joining us and for all you have done for the orcas and the salmon and the dams, and thanks to Howie for dragging me into this. And I feel very fortunate to be able to do something for the whales I love so much. Howie?
Well, we're all very fortunate that you did. You've helped to bind this organization together and make it work over the years, so in a hugely important way. So, and thanks to everybody who has been part of this. It's been a real pleasure, a real delight, I think. We've been able to talk about things near and dear to our hearts, and to all of ours. And I really appreciate the attendance and the great questions, and we'll follow up with this. I think we have a good thing going here, so we'll find ways to continue this. So thanks everybody.
Well, and I want to thank Cindy and Amanda also for being our techno goddesses and taking care of all our glitches. And yes, to all of you, because it's you who gives us hope. It's, you know, there are times when we just all feel despair and have our down moments. But we look out there and there are so many people who care and are interested that that keeps us going. So thanks for being there.
Bye-bye.
All right, thanks again, everybody. And we do have more webinars coming. Mondays at 4 o'clock for the next 4 weeks. So please tune in and we will see you at those. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Ken.
Enjoy the rest of this beautiful day.
Okay.